And you know what? I'm going to save this because I like the way that looks now. Now I'm going to update the file in my drive. So if you download it here now, you'll get with the clouds. Oh, you won't actually because it won't be packed in. Never mind. Don't worry about that. Oh, here. Maybe this is a good actually a learning moment or teaching moment to talk about how to pack and unpack textures for your projects. So I just made this blend file, and I was like, oh, I want to have this cool texture for my background. So I download it. It's on the desktop. I add it as a texture in my background in my world settings here as an environment texture. And then I'm like, oh, I'm going to upload it to my drive to share with everyone in class. But if you were to download this now and were to look at it in rendered mode, you'd probably see a purple background because it wouldn't know where that texture is. So there's a way to, and this is like, so Blender naturally functions kind of like how Premiere or After Effects might function in that the media that you have outside of the project needs to travel with the project file. So like when you were doing video editing, those video clips aren't inside of the project file. They are separate media that you travel with your project file if you move it to a different computer, etc. In general, that's how it works with Blender. But with image files, and I'm not sure about video files, possibly, but you're not going to be messing with those. With images, you can pack those into your blend. So as you save and as you add images, you can update, and those images are then contained within your blend file, and you can unpack them at any moment and have them like exist as a folder outside of your project file for you to edit if you wish. But if you like the image as is and you want that image to stay with your project file, you can pack it in. And what you have to do is go to File, and generally just go File, Save. There's another option at the bottom, External Data. If you turn on Automatically Pack into Blend, anytime you add an image as a texture and save your project, it'll update and bring that image texture into your project file. Or you can manually say pack all into .blend. And again, .blend is the file type for Blender projects. So if I go pack all into .blend, at the bottom we see a little info thing that popped up that said packed one file. And I only had one image texture, so one image is now inside of this blend. And if I save, and then uploaded this to my very messy Google Drive, with version 3, if you were to then now download that same project, it should have clouds in the background. So, diversion, but hey, it's a good skill to learn. And if you just don't want to think about it, just turn on Automatically Pack into Blend. And anytime you add a texture, image texture, to your project and you save your project, it's going to come standard. And I'm going to save. Is that working for everyone? Has anybody downloaded it and it works with the clouds? Yeah. It does? Okay, great. So, moving on. So we are now going to play around with particles. I talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the class. Particle systems are ways to, another set of tools that uses physics to model real-world behaviors. Some of the things you might model using particles. If you are emitting particles, like shooting out particles, like you might be emitting like maybe a gunshot. Maybe there's like a flare and like some like ember shooting out of the nozzle of a gun. Maybe you're, it could be sort of like sparks or embers coming off of a fire. It could be dust, like if something lands on the ground, like dust particles coming up. It could be confetti. It could be anything that is small and like a mass of small individual points that need to behave as though they are light. But essentially what it is you sort of making one object be an object that emits a bunch of points. And those points come out at a certain rate and speed, and they have a weight, and they can respond to wind and other force fields, etc. And you can use it to kind of fake making water if you wanted to. But it'll make a little bit more sense once we get into it. But we're going to use particles now to create like a spark emitter for the wick on our cannon right here. And then once the wick goes down, we're going to make a little confetti explosion come out of the cannon. So the first thing we'd want to do is we're going to add a sphere. We're going to do it this way. We're going to add a sphere. And I'm adding the sphere kind of at the end of this wick, and I'm going to scale it down so that it is about the diameter of this cylinder we have for our wick. It doesn't have to be exactly the diameter, but it's like about that size. And now I'm going to go to a new tab. I'm going to go to our particles tab. And that is just above our physics tab. And it looks like one dot with like 3 other dots shooting out from it. And at first glance, it's vacant. That's because we have no particle systems yet. But we have a familiar window. It kind of looks like our vertex groups. It looks like our shape keys. Looks like our material slots where we can press on the plus button and it will create a new thing. And when we do that, it creates a new particle settings, a new particle system. And there's a lot of options here. I'm going to move my window over a little bit so we can see it a little more clearly. But it's not super complicated. It can get very complicated, but we're just going to go over the basics here. So the first value we have is number. So this is set at 1,000. So it's saying this sphere we just made is going to emit or shoot out 1,000 little particles. The next value is seed. That's just a value you can change to sort of change the randomness of a value. We're not going to mess with that. But what we do want to pay attention to is frame start and end. So we have frame start, so it starts at frame 1 and ends at frame 200. So from frame 1 to frame 200, over that amount of time, 1,000 particles are coming out of this orb. We have lifetime. So over that amount of time, over 200 frames, 1,000 particles are coming out, and each particle will exist. Its life from emission to death will be 50 frames. If we made that value like 500 frames, none of those particles would disappear. They're just sort of hanging. If we made it really short, it'd be like they have really short life cycles, essentially. And then we have a randomness factor to this. So if I hit play, right away, we can see particles are emitting until we get to frame 200 here, and then it stops. And these particles, if we look in X-ray mode, live for a while. We have it set to lifetime of 50 frames. If I were to change that to 10, and I can do that on the fly, we see that the lifetime of those particles changes a lot. Maybe I'll make it 15. Screw it, 20. And so we want this is like the sparks from like the ignition on this like wick. Maybe we say we want this wick to finish and trigger the explosion at just a little bit less than 200, let's say 150. So I'm going to change the end time for this particle system to 150. And now, if I play from frame 0 or frame 1 to 150, 1,000 particles come out. If I change this to frame 2, so this is only 1 frame or 2 frames of this particle system, it starts and ends emitting after like 1 frame. At the very beginning, 1,000 or just shoot out at once. and a big blob.
Right back in the stick so we can get a good view. Right down.
And we have these particles coming out, but we want them to interact with the environment. So we need to add something to this ground element so that they can bounce off this. And if we go to our physics tab, which of these would I add to this object? So rigid bodies might be what your first instinct, but rigid bodies only interact with other rigid body objects. They're kind of like their own system in a way. Collision. Collision. So collision is what we used when we did our cloth modifier. If it's not a rigid body and you want it to hit something, if you wanted something to collide with that, turn on collision. And now we see they're kind of like bouncing off a little bit. Let's change some factors here to give it a little more lifelike quality. Let's change the randomness to the lifetime here. And maybe let's up the lifetime a little bit. And when we see like, imagine like a sparkler or something like that, the sparks aren't just like falling heavily to the ground. They are a little more light, and they sort of shoot out in a more like radial, sort of like with radial energy, you know? So let's change the way these particles are being emitted from the sphere. We changed the time settings for when they start and end and how many. And we could even change it to more. We could say like 5,000 and see if my computer crashes. It did not. That's great. Let's change some settings here. So our next set of options here is our cache. So this again would be where we bake our particles. Just like how we bake a rigid body simulation in our rigid body world, if we wanted to individually bake just the scenario going on with our particles, we would hit bake here. We're not going to bother with that right now. First, we're going to change some things. The next option is velocity. So if I change z to something larger as I increase that value, and I'm going to make this loop so we can kind of just see what's going on. If I change the z object align, so it's looking at this object and the z value from that going up, we can change that so it's like spewing them upwards. We could change it to y, shoot in that direction, or also x, to shoot in that. And it's shooting in positive x. Remember, there's a positive and negative x value. If I did negative x, it would go in that x direction. Same with y. And there's also a normal velocity. And what normal means is, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's like, maybe I'll try to do it with them, which you won't see on the video, but whatever. A normal is essentially the direction perpendicular to the face of an object. So if I have a cube here, this cube, the normal of this object is sort of shooting out from the center perpendicular to the face of that. If we were to look at that same cube and that same arrow from the side, the normal of this face is here. It's coming out that way. This is the normal. Just sort of shooting outwards from the face of an object. This orientation of that face sort of shooting it. It's like the directional of that face, of that polygon. Essentially, it just means outwards. So when we look at this sphere and we say we want to increase the normal velocity, it's just sort of the radial energy of that, the outwards energy from this object based on its geometry. But since we have a sphere, it's pretty basic. It's just shooting outwards. That looks a little bit more like a sort of sparkler. And in fact, we might want to change the lifetime of that a little bit. Something like that. So like, you know, there could maybe be a few stray bouncing sparks, but mostly it's like just sort of emanating. Maybe we had to up the speed. Nah, it looked good like that. I think we got it at 6. So now we have a good velocity coming from this object. And there's some other options, but we're not going to do that for this spark. For this spark, there's an option to say, let's change the rotation of each of these particles. But we're working with the object that we're trying to emit, like a spark, like it's just like a tiny particle, and it doesn't really have a directional rotation. When you look at a spark, you don't say like, oh, that spark is rotated. It's not big enough to really see the rotation of that, so we don't need to worry about that. We just need to know how it's moving around the world, not how its individually parts are rotating. That's what we're going to do with confetti. But we have a velocity, and we have a good sense of like the amount and when this action is occurring. I'm going to extend time of my animation. And if I wanted to, I could bake that particle system. Oh, another thing I could do, I could make this cannon, because some of these sparks are going through this cannon. So I want to add also a collision to that, and maybe also, why not, to these legs over here. I'm going to apply the scale there just in case. Oh, and this guy too. Why not? So now it's kind of like bouncing off that, which makes it just feel more realistic. So we have this sphere emitting particles over time. Oh, and maybe before I bake that, let me undo that bake. Oh, it's already not baked. That's great. So we have it going, but we want this wick to be decreasing, because it's like supposed to be eating up this wick. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this whole thing over so it just looks like it's eating it and it's sort of disappearing inside the cannon. We're not going to look inside the cannon, so I'm going to use that as a prop to sort of hide things. And I'm going to take my generator here, select it, then hold Shift, select this wick, and right-click, Parent Object. So this wick now is following, or the emitter is now following the wick. I can now go to frame 1. I could add a keyframe for location, and then at frame 150, when the particles end, I could move that in here and add another keyframe. And so now, if we hit play, boom. Maybe now I could try to bake this as a memory. And we have a camera in scene. I'm going to reposition that so we can see what's going on here. I haven't done an orthographic view for a while. I like orthographic sometimes. It can make things feel more like video game-like. And if we render in our viewport, we see some particles there. But let's just see what happens if I try to render the image. Nothing shows up. We see the emitter, but we don't see anything taking the place of those dots. And that's because we have to tell the particle generator what to put in place of each of those dots, what to render in place of those. Right now, they're just sort of placeholders to help you get an idea of how this thing is functioning and moving around the world. So if I select my emitter and go back to my particle tab, if I scroll down, there is a render option. Right now it says render as halo. And that's what we're seeing right now. That's a term for this little dot, is a halo. It's a non-rendering object. What we want to say is render as an object. We want to put an object there. And then it gives us some other options. And it gives us an object, it gives it an option to choose an object to put in that place, an instance object here. So I'm going to create an object. I'm just going to place it underneath our scene so we don't have to look at it. You'll see why later. I'm going to add a mesh. I'm going to choose, instead of a UV sphere, I'm going to choose an icosphere, because the icosphere generally has fewer polygons. I just use it because it's like a little more low poly of a sphere. And I'm going to change the option so it's just one subdivision. So it's a sphere-ish looking object, but with not very many polygons. And I'm going to give this a material. We'll call it Spark. And instead of having it be a principled shader, I'm going to make this, where is it? An emission. So it'll emit light, maybe get a value of 3. So now, when I go back to my particle emitter and to those systems, I can say render the instant object, and we'll say I can choose this eyedropper and choose the icosphere. And when I do that, now that sphere, that little icosphere, is showing up instead of those halos in my scene. And if I were to render an image right now, we'd see that there's sparks coming out of this. But there's still an issue here, which is that we see that emitter object, that sphere that we created to produce these sparks, is showing up in our scene, and we don't want it to actually be rendered. We just want it to be, I mean, what we could do is we could say, hey, give that the same material so it looks like a spark blob, a big spark orb, which maybe that actually works for our situation here. Or, with that selected, in our particle settings, right under where we chose to render as an object, we have an option to show the emitter or not. Right now it says show emitter. An emitter is the terminology for the object you have that is emitting these particles. If I turn that off and then render the image, it's not there anymore. But I think it actually works better to have it in the image. So right now we have our spark, our wick, being burnt up. Gets to that point, 150, it stops emitting, and we'll say at 160, we're going to have another action, and it's going to be our confetti cannon. So I'm going to create a new emitter. And I'm going to add a plane. And I'm just going to nestle that inside of our cannon here. Make it a little bit smaller so it's not like clipping the geometry inside. And this is going to be our emitter. I'm not going to worry about giving it a material because I'm going to make it, the emitter itself become invisible later. So with this new object selected, I'm going to go to my Particles tab, and I'm going to add a new instance. And every time you add a new particle system, it comes up with these default settings. It's like 1,000, from frame 1 to 200, lifetime 50, yada yada. If I wanted to, if I click on these new settings, I could choose the same settings I had before for my spark. And if I had another, if I wanted to have spark somewhere else, I could attach that and have the same particle system play out. But it would have the same timing and everything. That's not what we want. So we have a new particle system. And what would I do for the frame start and end time? We want this to be like an explosion. And our last spark ends at like around 150. So what would I put for the frame start and end value here, maybe? 150 to start? And then what would be our end time?
Like maybe 200.
200? So it'd be like a second and a half or 2 seconds of explode, like that. Let's see how that looks. We'll do 150 to 200. Goes in. Oh. And then it's emitting it, but we're not really seeing it because we have to change something else. We have to change the velocity. So for this, I could try, maybe let's try adjusting the normal and see what happens. That works pretty good because this is just a plane, so it's just going perpendicular to the shape of that plane. It's just shooting outwards from that plane. We could also do object align Z and see how that works. Oh, that was like 20. That also works because this is shooting out based on the object. So like this object, its original rotation was like this, and Z was going upwards, and all I did was rotate it. So it's taking that original object and sort of assuming the original rotation, like from X, Y, and Z based on that object. But let's just do normal because that's fine. And so now if we look at it, free for 100, boom. Maybe it's a little too long for, and maybe the velocity is a little too high right now. Let's go up. So maybe we want to change the end time. So we're looking for like a poof. So maybe we're going to look at an end time of what? Anybody? 170? So that we're at 24 frames a second. So that's like about a second. Boom. Better, I would say, I would even do something like 153. 3 frames. Boom. And maybe let's make this velocity a little random. So in our velocity settings, we have the straight value for anything, and then we have a randomization. It didn't work very well. It kind of worked. Let's try 50. Anyways. Okay. Yeah, anyways. So we have more of a sort of like explosion now. It's just like boom. Oh, there we go. How it's working. I think it just loaded some things into frame. So let's try less randomization. More like 20. Boom. Better. Let's try 15. That looks better. Maybe let's reposition our camera so we can see more of what's going on. So we have zip, and then boom. The next thing I want to play around with here is, and again, I'm still just working with these halos, these like non-rendered objects. And usually whenever I set up a particle system, I do that because it's going to run faster. If you have actual objects in places of all these dots, it has to render those meshes and it has to have store memory for each of those vertices traveling through space. So I usually will dial in the motion before placing an object to be rendered in place of these halos because it's going to be easier to tweak. So the thing about this explosion here is that I wanted to make like a confetti cannon, and confetti cannons shoot out like paper or confetti or whatever, and then those things, because they're made of paper, eventually they slow down in air and then start to float down. They don't like have their trajectory through space, their energy through space isn't constant, like if you were to, or at least how you could see it, like how you throw a ball. You throw a ball, it just goes, phew. If you have a piece of paper, and I try to throw a piece of paper, that's not what happens, you know, right? It doesn't just go. You throw it, initially it has some speed, and then it just because it's so light and it has like this face, it just catches the wind and then it just slows down. And what we call that in our particle world here is damping. So I'm going to go to my settings here for my particle. I'm going to go to physics, and we're going to change some things. Maybe I'll try making this the size, the mass, like 0.2 kilograms. Right now, the physics type is Newtonian, which essentially means our world, and meaning like, you know, Isaac Newton, like gravity. That's what we're living in right now, in terms of, I guess, our real world and what we're looking at right here, Newtonian. We have keyed. I don't even know what that means. And then there's Boyds and fluid. Boyds is for like birds, like Boyds. I guess that's why they call it that. And then fluid, which like makes these particles behave as though they are more fluid-like. I'm going to keep it in Newtonian. And we have some other options here. We have, I'm going to change the timing of our animation just so we can loop this a little bit better when we make these changes. We have Brownian, drag, and damp. So drag and damp are similar. Drag, if you hover your mouse over there, is the amount of air drag, the amount of drag air has on an object while it's moving through space. So if I were to, and you don't have to change it by very much for it to have an influence. I'm going to say something like, I'm just going to do 1 for drag and see how that works. See what happened? Do 0.2. What's happening is as those things move through space is that their inertia, their velocity slows down through the air, as though the air is slowing it down. Damp does a similar thing. It's a little bit more drastic. This is more like kind of like a confetti cannon situation where it's like poof, and then it just rains down. So another option we have here is Brownian. Does anyone understand what Brownian is? It's like a physics term. Brownian is like, it is short for Brownian motion, which is like, how it's like a physics term, like a scientific term for the way things erratically move when it comes down to sort of like the way you see things behave in nature, specifically on a cellular level, on a small level. Brownian motion is the sort of chaotic or like, what would you call it, like quantum chaos to motion in the world, and you can turn that up if you want. See how it's like sort of acts like as though it's like some weird like bug. Sometimes you could use it to be like, oh, this is like more like bugs. It has this sort of chaotic motion to it, which actually works well for our confetti here.
Would it be like a firework?
Kinda, yeah. So like you think about fireworks where they're like,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So let's extend our animation to have more time to see this explosion. Boom. Oh. And maybe let's give those particles a little bit longer of a lifetime. Let's give them like a 75, 100 frames. They deserve it. And so we have, all right. So what's our next step? We have this looking good. We can bake that. So now that motion is baked into our Blender file. What's the next step? What's that? Add a material, exactly. So right now these particles are just halos, remember? They're just rendered as rings of light. So we need to go to our render settings and go from halo, and we're going to choose something else other than object. So before we created this like sort of spark object, and that's going to be the only spark object we use for our wick. What we're going to use for the confetti can is we want to have some different colors. We want to maybe have some variety for these like paper pieces. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create like 4 different paper pieces that are going to shoot out. And we're going to put them in their own group, what we call a collection here. And then we're going to have this particle system say, grab at random anything that's in this group and use that to render. So we haven't really used collections very much so far, at least in the content I've been like going through in like demos. But collections are a way to organize your scene. So by default, there's always one collection. And that's just whatever's in this scene is in that collection. I can turn that on and off and collapse it if I don't want to look at everything in that collection. And I can add a new collection. I could, up here at the right, click Add New. And I have Collection 2. I'm going to call this Confetti. And now we have a new collection. And I'm going to select that. And make sure that collection is selected when I add these new objects. So I'm going to add a plane. And this will be Confetti 1. Let's call it C1. I'm going to give it a material. We'll just do yellow. And then I'm going to duplicate that. Add a new material. Well, I'm going to use the base material I have for that, which is like confetti. I'm just going to click on this new material. It's going to make a new version of that one we already have. I'm going to change the base color to green. Duplicate again. Add a new material. Make that one blue. And then we'll maybe just do red. I'm sorry, I'm going a little fast here. But now we have, in this new collection, 4 little confetti pieces, each with their own color. Maybe let's add some size variation to them. Make one kind of big and square, make one kind of really skinny. And that'll be like a regular one or something. And I'm going to apply scale for all of this. And they're in their own collection, and I can hide that collection if I want. And now I'm going to select my particle emitter and go to the particle settings. And in my render, instead of saying render as object, I'm going to say collection. And then I'm going to type in, or just select, confetti. And now we have all these confetti pieces coming out. And I sort of chose at random in a general equal sort of patterning each of these pieces. But now we're showing something that actually has a rotation to it. Before we were working with a spark, and that spark was just a point of light, essentially. And if it rotated, you couldn't really tell. Now we're working with confetti, something that has an actual rotation to it, where you can see it is aligned right now. They're all sort of flat. So we want to change the rotation on this. So I'm going to have to make some edits. I'm going to need to delete the bake that I made prior in my cache here, just so I can make some changes and see how they update. I'm going to go into solid mode. And we're going to turn on rotation. And I'm going to, right now the rotation is based on the velocity of this. So it's kind of like the velocity of this emitter is going to be affecting the rotation of this confetti piece. And I'm going to turn up the randomize on that. And let's see what happens. It's kind of working. And I'm going to turn on dynamic as well. So all I did is click rotation, turn that on. It's using the velocity of these pieces as sort of the basis for how it's going to rotate. But we want to randomize that. So I just turned up the randomization and made sure it was dynamic down here. And now if I bake, boom, we have confetti. And to see the whole animation, that's what I did in this mode. We have our spark going in, triggering the explosion of confetti. And of course, our simulation sort of ends, our confetti ends about like right here, and we could just end our animation right there, because we're just making a short one here. And now I'm going to render out, and then we'll see how it looks. I'm going to do it at 50% so it goes faster.
Crear, necesitas.
And I'm going to